You said you're a
cycling
cycle maximalist when we spoke previously, and you said it's going to do the same shit again.
Yeah,
So-
feeling pretty good about that one. Huh?
So you sold into it?
I did not. No, I did not.
I thought you were a cycle maximalist.
Well, I think it's about mentally preparing, right?
Yeah.
So I do still believe that Bitcoin is cyclical. So if we want to start on economic grounds, I think that's a good one because I still think the Bitcoin cycle theory is intact based on my defining of it. I know that there's a lot of attack on that these days, but I think that right now you can economically coordinate around Bitcoin, right? Bitcoin. So there's this, if you back up, there's this big trend in the space right now, right? Which is that every 4 years we're seeing, these kind of big bubbles in the Bitcoin and wider crypto industry. And I still think one of the big unanswered questions is why is this occurring and why is this occurring with such regularity? So, there's two ways to approach that question. Either you try to, dismantle it and say that the question doesn't exist, or you accept the question, right? So I think we have to accept the frame. Do you accept that there has been 4 Bitcoin bubbles, and do you accept that they have been 4 years apart?
I accept that, yeah.
Right. Okay, so then that's an interesting piece of data, right? So then it says you as an individual have to say, do I think that this is going to happen again, or do I think that it's not going to happen again? I like the cycle theory because it's, like many of the great things in the cryptocurrency space, it's like a very unhappy medium. It satisfies no one, and everyone hates it like sort of equally for like different reasons. Sort of like Tether, right? A good example. Nobody wants Bitcoin to be cyclical because that says that we have to go through another downturn. It says that we're like not the master of our domains to some extent. It means that we're subject to like the economic advancement of Bitcoin. And that there's very little that we can, as humans, can do to impact that, right? That's like one definition by which it's unfriendly. But Bitcoin cycles were a pretty big factor in me understanding or coming over to the Bitcoin maximalist camp. Because as you know, I was a journalist, right? And trying to understand, okay, like what is happening here? What makes Bitcoin, why is Bitcoin successful? And the further I go back into the archives, right, the more that I dig into it, I think the only thing that really separates Bitcoin from the other digital cash projects before it is its economics. And I've recently spent the last few months kind of digging into like the 1990s projects and so on.
Hold on. What separates it from its other projects?
The other digital cash, attempts in the 1990s that were unsuccessful.
You have to include decentralization in that.
Yeah, that is a factor as well. There's a couple. I recently just went through this whole period where I kind of dug through the 1990s digital cash projects archives myself, and I'd never really done the primary research of looking at that and kind of going through month by month. Okay, what are they talking about in the cypherpunk mailing list? And I think there's really 2 like leapfrogs there, right? So the first is that David Chaum eventually in the 1980s figures out how to make digital cash work. He just does it with a patented process called blind signatures, right? So then flash forward to the 1990s, he's not released that project, and he has tried to commercialize that project by selling it to banks. So they need a way to route around that. So then you get to essentially decentralization, right? Because you can't replicate Chaum's solution. So you have to find some way to distribute the operations of it, essentially, or you'd violate his patent. And then once they figured that out, there was a series of attempts to try to make different digital caches. And then the problem that they kept running into is that essentially there was no reason for people to use it as money. Like there was no reason for early adopters to start using it. And this was actually true of eCash and DigiCash as well, right? So that you could have a digital dollar on the internet. Like David Chaum created that in the 1990s. He offered that as a service.
They created a shop as well, didn't they?
Yeah, they had like a Missouri bank like offered it. You could create an eCash account and like merchants could accept it. But there's no reason for that flywheel of adoption to start. So I don't know. I've just become increasingly convinced over the years that it's, and this is why, I think my sympathies towards Bitcoin maximalism and economic and monetary Bitcoin maximalism essentially starts there. It's that, yeah, really what we're talking about is the innovation of Bitcoin here is economic. It has nothing to do with like the particular component pieces like of its technology, which were previously around. It's that finally in Bitcoin, there is something that is released that people actually adopt, start using. And this is actually particularly something you really notice like before Bitcoin has a price. So there's this period in late 2009, like early 2010, where Bitcoin is increasing in price, but there's no price. This is like a weird concept, but it's increasingly clear that Bitcoin is more scarce. And people are starting to price it. They're starting to offer goods and services in it. And they're starting to try to earn Bitcoin in increasing ways. And again, like Bitcoin still has no, like a Bitcoin is still worth like $1 is worth like 200 Bitcoin or something like that, right? You're stealing like minuscule variations. And it's like there's still no exchanges all of the economic scarcity and pressure is happening within a small component of like, there's no exchange or like market to like, to metastasize that in, right? Like there's no market price, but yet there is demand and scarcity. And so you can see the impacts of demand and scarcity and like the monetary attributes of Bitcoin working without the price or the cryptocurrency market. And I think it's really interesting to kind of like divorce those two things and actually say even before there were exchanges, like even before there was a Bitcoin price, you still had essentially the same dynamic, which was that this idea that Bitcoin was increasingly scarce, it was increasingly valued, and then people were like competing to acquire it. And then what was increasing was there a competition to acquire it. And that then metastasizes sort of in a dollar price in like an exchange and then that resources. But the actual behavior occurred first. And that's like, I think, the really important part that a lot of the cryptocurrency general people miss, right? Bitcoin does have a unique start, right?
And do you think the increases in the price, that kind of hodl mentality, kind of forced it into a place where people then started spending it because people started accumulating value? So they'll spend a bit, sell a bit off, but everyone else is still holding, so they've got value. And then you always get to a bit where you're like, well, I've got quite a bit of this. I've got enough now to spend a bit.
Yeah, there's this interesting push-pull dynamic where, you know, people within the Bitcoin economy are always trying to move it forward, right? And the question is like, when do you personally take responsibility to do that, right? Laszlo, you know, offering to buy pizzas for Bitcoin was essentially like, you know, he had been somewhat publicly shamed for acquiring too much Bitcoin, and then he paid it forward, right? And then essentially there was the economy developed, right? So I guess all this is to say is essentially it's like, to your question, it's like I still think the economics of Bitcoin are something that are really not well understood. I still think like the cryptocurrency, like the lens on the whole space, like tends to gravitate towards technology, right? So even like we're talking about Bitcoin maximalism, against other cryptocurrencies, really we're debating technology a lot. But economics are important, right? And I think a key part of Bitcoin's success was economics. And that leads me to be very sympathetic to the cycle theory of Bitcoin because, again, I think, you know, you have to accept that these factors that made Bitcoin successful like always occurred. They occurred in perpetuity as far back as like the earliest days of the project. And we're just seeing them at a different level now. But it gives me a lot of confidence that they actually occurred prior to that. You know, they were pre-existent.
And so this cycle maximalism, does it give you the confidence then? Because sometimes you doubt things. I can't remember. Who were we talking to the other day who said?
It was yesterday.
Harry.
Yeah.
Harry Sadek. And he was like, well, when the price hit 3,000 last time, I was like, what if we're wrong? What if it just doesn't work?
I think that's the interesting thing and why I would say Bitcoin cycles are an always unpopular thing because they're very non-intuitive, right? It's this idea that something would be regular or cyclical is something that everybody wants to fight against, both the people who are against the idea and the people who are for Bitcoin. So like no party wants that to be true. And so therefore it's like the least popular middle equilibrium is that just like keeps occurring merely because of its like, you know, huge unpopularity. But again, I would say that, you know, I think a lot of people get hung up on cycle theory being about specific things. So I had a conversation with Pierre Rissard recently where I defended this point. And I said that to me, like cycle theory basically just states that as long as people are economically coordinating around the Bitcoin halving or the Bitcoin's monetary policy for their own advantage, for their own economic advantage, as long as that coordination takes place and people coordinate around the monetary policy changes, the cycle theory is still intact. So I'll give you an example of that. So we know that now the next halving is coming up in 2024.
How long are we away from that?
I think it's April 24 is so year and a half.
So it's to your advantage to acquire Bitcoin in some period before that and probably thereafter that. You would know based on past performance. So the question then is, will people economically coordinate to that behavior again? And will it occur again? So Pierre was basically saying to me is like, what are the conditions under which you would abandon this theory? And I basically said, you know, if the Bitcoin price were to hit an all-time high, again, before the halving, basically people coordinated for their economic benefit without the halving being a significant stakeholder at all, I would say that the theory is dead. As long as that economic coordination happens in any way after the halving, as somewhat a result of the halving, it doesn't matter where after it occurs, it doesn't matter what peak it occurs, it doesn't matter at what time of the year it occurs. It just states that does the actual mechanism work? Does the actual scarcity of the money within the money supply and the changing dynamics of that encourage people to economically coordinate on a repeated basis as a result of the policy.
So in 9 months, the countdown will begin because the
Right.
countdown starts from a year. People start talking. I mean, we've seen people talk about it a little bit. And then last time it was front run about 6 months, but
Well, I would actually want to be clear. Like, so I thought the Bitcoin halving was the stupidest thing ever for many years, right? So again, my people who don't know about my background, I was an editor of CoinDesk for many years and was, essentially in the no coiner camp for nothing other than my own, probably inability to intellectualize things at that point. But like, when people would come up to me and they'd be like, "Oh, what do you think about the halving? Like halving, it's going to go up. It's going to go up. It's going to be so much." I'm going to be like, "Oh my God, like, get out of my face. I don't know what to deal with you. I don't know what to do with you. That's weird pipe dream that you have," right? So like, again, like I understand being somewhat intellectually disgusted with these ideas. Like it's something that I'm really sympathetic to. I've been in that camp.
well, the original theory doesn't make sense in that the idea being that the supply halves and therefore there's less supply in the market being sold off by the miners, because we've had the experience where miners actually don't even sell sometimes. So
It's just about the availability of money within the economy and then assuming that demand is constant or demand increases because people think that it's to their advantage, right? So this is why the only term that I want to stick in there for people to gravitate to is like economic coordination.
yeah,
Do people coordinate around Bitcoin for their own economic benefit? And does that happen as a result of like the policies within the code? Because if it does, and that is true, then it's true that Bitcoin is like an economic system because you can coordinate around that, right? It doesn't mean that the code is the thing that's doing that. It's like we as humans have agency. So like right now, like maybe you're not buying as much Bitcoin, right? There's just a big bubble. Things are low. Maybe you're not sure that maybe you are not economically coordinating around Bitcoin. The question is like, will you? And when will you again, right? So again, like the interesting
waiting for the herd.
Well, again, Bitcoin, the thing that it has about itself. So I think Gwern wrote this, and I've increasingly been like really like sitting with this and thinking about this. Is that he wrote a Bitcoin as that. This was in 2011, and he's like a open source kind of computer science guy. But he essentially said the only thing that Bitcoin really achieved was that it it didn't get everything right about digital cash. It just ensured that that it would continue to exist in the future, like long enough for people to solve the problems. Like that was the thing that it got right. Right, it didn't get everything right. It was working, and it continued to work, and you could continue to improve it. And essentially, like his argument was like that was enough, right? That was the thing that prior. And again, if you look at the kind of history of digital cash, it's like there wasn't anything to work on. There was nothing that was public for like many, many years. Like nothing got past like the theory or being like released on the mailing list and like one guy download. Like simply nothing existed.
But there's a term for that, isn't there? The longer something's existed, the more likely it is to continue to exist. I can't remember what the name is.
Yeah, there is. Yeah,
Something's law or something's theorem.
there's always a law or theorem for everything. Though, right?
Yeah. I forget them all.
So like Rizzo's theorem, I guess, would be would be that Bitcoin cycles are really about economic coordination, right? As long as Bitcoin continues to exist and other assets continue to exist and people exist in other economies, as long as Bitcoin creates the conditions under which other people will economically coordinate around it, then you would imagine that activity would be somewhat resultant of the halving and the monetary policy changes. Or you don't believe that the monetary policy matters, which I don't really understand that view at all.
What if they don't?
What if they don't think it matters?
Or if they don't economically coordinate around it this next
Well,
time?
plenty of people are not economically coordinating around Bitcoin. But you could argue that over time, the people who are economically coordinating around Bitcoin has gotten larger.
Yeah. So it has to be enough. But what if this halving theorem dies?
But people say that before every halving, right?
Of course.
Yeah.
But we know more now.
Well, what do we know that we didn't know before? Like what?
Well, I guess before it was like deeply embedded the idea that the market would be flooded with a lot more coins. A lot less coins that would be making your coins worth a lot more. But it was a narrative build.
Yeah, I don't understand this at all because like the price went down to like $3,000 and it went up to $60,000 within like a few months. Like, so I mean, if that doesn't do it for you, like I don't know what to tell you. Like I don't know.
Yeah, but I wonder if it's more the narrative that people rather than the economics. They bought the narrative. They think the halving's coming. They think it's going to be front run. It's happened 4 times before. It must happen again, rather than actually it is a response to the specific.
Well, there's sort of like two counter theories to that, right? So one of the theories is essentially like people. So this is the efficient market hypothesis. I think Nick Carter wrote about this. Was essentially that all information known about a market should be priced in, so people should price in the future halving. So the problem that I have with that is I think that it assumes that everyone understands Bitcoin. Like it assumes that everyone understands how it works, and I think that's incorrect. So the Bitcoin market is by nature inefficient because not all the stakeholders in it have the same knowledge. So Bitcoin has this interesting like game theoretical asymmetry where, people coming in who are new don't have the same information as people who have been here. And so then they play the game differently. So they're economically coordinating differently. But again, like all this goes back to, I think that the same behaviors, and my point with the original kind of diatribe on, okay, well, these behaviors will always present, like irregardless of a cryptocurrency market, irregardless of exchanges, like irregardless of there even being a price. Like Bitcoin created the conditions under which its adoption occurred. Right, by making the coins scarce to acquire.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So let me just draw a picture because I think it'll make it. It's late 2009. You've just heard about Bitcoin. It has no price, and it's too hard for you to mine, so you can't mine it. So how do you get it? Right. So more people want to acquire the thing. So Bitcoin seems to create the conditions under which, again, like that want distributes to the market. Again, I'm not an economist, so I don't really understand this all in aggregate. But I would say like an interesting period, if I was an economist to study, would be this time period because it seems to be that these same behaviors actually predate there being a price or like in a cryptocurrency exchange or any sort of like cryptocurrency market, right? Where Bitcoin created the conditions under which, again, with an influx in demand, there was just this explosion of interest and use. And again, like the price is a signal of that. It is not the entirety of that. And it's actually, I think, says a lot that it occurred without it, right? Because if it occurred without it, I'm much more likely to believe that it will continue into the future because it was a priori. It existed. It was something that existed without the current conditions and now should only continue to benefit from the continued conditions, right? It's more accessible.
Bring on the next run then.
Well, look, I'm coordinating around. I'll just be honest, I'll lay it on the table. It's a bear market. I guess we don't have anything to lose. I'm coordinating around Bitcoin.
What if you are and then I am? And then if I am, Danny should, and so should Jeremy, and then...
Right. But we're all playing the game differently.
Yeah.
We're not coordinating the same.
But similarly.
Right.
We're all coordinating for an upwards move.
Eventually, right, yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
None of us are selling.
No, yeah, that's right.
So we're just accumulating.
But just because you're not selling doesn't mean that you're buying, right? So there's different behaviors, right? So for myself, like I did not buy Bitcoin at all for like 2021 or 2022. Is it 2023? I don't know what year it is.
We're in 2022 now.
Okay, that's good to know. I only recently, started. I started economically coordinating around Bitcoin.
Well, your timing's probably better than the majority of mine in the last 4 years.
Well, so
3
again,
years.
like I think part of the cycle theory as well, again, I don't know how much you want to spend on this, but again, I think that there's a point at which the resultant like price activity and euphoria like overwhelms the cryptocurrency companies, like the for-profit companies in the industry, and they simply can't continue to like function under that demand. And then essentially like, it's their kind of capitulation that usually kind of signals the end of the bull cycle.